Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Friday Symposium. I'm Diane Sayre, president of the LaRouche Organization, and today is March 14th. And as always, if we pre-record something these days, even by a few hours, I always like to let my viewers know that because developments are happening so rapidly that something might happen in the next 3 hours. And if you're wondering why we didn't take it up, that's why. But it is Friday, March 14th, and I'm happy to be joined today by Garland Nixon, who is a radio talk show host, political analyst. I'm not going to spend a long time with the briefing because he'll have a lot to say, as will I. And I will say in way of introduction that I am happy to have him join me because he is intelligent and has a good sense of humor, both traits which you need in these days. So welcome.
Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate it. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you. So I'm just going to start right away with a post that President Trump put out on Truth Social this morning, and we can take that as a starting point for the Russia-Ukraine situation, where this stands, where you think it's going, etc. He writes, We had very good and productive discussions with President Vladimir Putin of Russia yesterday, and there is a very good chance that this horrible, bloody war can finally come to an end. And then in all caps, but at this very moment, thousands of Ukrainian troops are completely surrounded by the Russian military and in a very bad and vulnerable position. I have strongly requested to President Putin that their lives be spared. This would be a horrible massacre, not seen since World War II. God bless them all. So maybe we'll start with that. What's that about? What do you make of that?
Well, it's interesting because I was discussing the plea for a ceasefire here before I heard any of this. And one of the things that I brought up jokingly, I said, well, I think it's kind of convenient that at a time when the Ukrainians are being, surrounded and their defenses in Kursk are collapsing, that all of a sudden they are all out for a 30-day ceasefire, which would be just enough time for them to get all of their people out. Okay, can we have a ceasefire? How long? Just long enough to get all of those troops that are surrounded out. And in fact, one of the things that President Putin brought up when he spoke about the request for a ceasefire was, and what would happen to those soldiers in Kursk that we've surrounded? Would they just be allowed to walk away? Would their arms be? Would they just drop their arms and surrender, etc.? So I think let me put it to you like this: it's a bad look, because if I'm the Russians, I look at it and I say, cynically, well, you didn't really want a ceasefire. When your people got surrounded, you came to us begging for mercy, trying to get them out of that. But this is a war. And if they surrounded a bunch of Russians, they ain't letting them go. Might I add, this also harkens back to 2014, 2015. The exact same thing happened, and that was the foundation for the Minsk Accords, wherein it was called the Battle of Sepultava, where the Eastern Ukrainians fought back against the Maidan coup. They fought against the Ukrainian military, which wasn't very strong. They had them surrounded at a town called Sepultava. I don't remember. It might have been up to 30,000 of them, at which time Angela Merkel flew to Moscow and did the exact same thing, made a plea for them, let's get a deal. And there was the Minsk Accords. That was the first Minsk Accords. There were further Minsk Accords, but that's exactly what happened before. And if I'm thinking, if I'm the Russians, I'm thinking, there's no lesson to be learned by getting kicked by the same mule twice. So the fact of the matter is, it's a bad look. And it really makes it appear as though there was not a genuine appeal for peace. That this was, just a self-serving move to get your soldiers, to get the enemy soldiers out because they were surrounded. And might I add, they were in Russia. And they initially said, we're going to take some of Russia and we'll trade it back. And they committed atrocities. It is alleged that they've committed atrocities in Russia. I suspect the
Right.
Russians aren't going to buy
I
it, and I
wanted
wouldn't
to
expect them
say
to.
on that, Nebenzia explicitly referenced a case that they found of 7 people tortured to death in a basement, which is what he was in his speech at the UN Security Council, I think 2 days ago, when that little pipsqueak from Estonia was here to make her case for the European Union, and he went through that. So, yeah, absolutely. And of course, we have Merkel and was it Francois Hollande who
Yes.
presided over the Minsk
And
Accord?
Petro Poroshenko.
Right. And Merkel and Hollande, who said, well, we didn't really intend for this to be we intended to buy time for Ukraine to rearm. So why on earth would Russia go along with this? Now, do you think the Trump team is aware of the fact that the Europeans have lied about every single thing? Of course, we have as well, but that wasn't the Trump administration. But do you think Trump is aware of how badly the Europeans have been caught in all these lies?
Absolutely. I believe that Trump, I mean, Tulsi Gabbard knows, the people knows. I think Trump is very, very well informed. I still think he's trying to get deals as best he can to his advantage. I think there's, I'm very cynical about this whole thing. Now, don't get me wrong. I want peace, because certainly the danger of nuclear war to all of us, any way we can abate that danger, I'm for it. But I'm very cynical about a lot of this. But I think this, if I'm on the Russian side and I look at this, because of the timing and because the first thing the president Trump calls, says when he calls this, hey, what about all those troops? You think we could get them out? I then look at it and say, well, if I thought that they were genuine in their appeal for peace, I will, get rid of that thought immediately. It seems to me that they're just trying to, save these troops. And additionally, even as they were pleading for mercy for these surrounded troops, the Ukrainians were still saying, but we won't give up anything. We will not accept we tried to take some of Russia and we failed. Okay, let our troops go. Meanwhile, the areas of Russia that Russia has taken, we want those back. And this is important. I got to bring something up because a lot of people don't talk about the areas that were formerly Eastern Ukraine that are now Russia. This is critical information about that. There are millions of people there who are ethnic Russians, who speak Russian, who are Russian Orthodox Christians, right? So what we are to believe is that the current Ukrainian government, who is vociferously anti-Russian, hate Russians with a flaming passion, right, have been involved in atrocities against Russians. What we're to believe is that they want areas back that are all Russians, that they want to bring those regions back. And the people in those regions, when they come back to Ukraine, their language will be illegal. Their religion will be illegal. They will not be allowed to speak their language. They will not be allowed to teach in their language. They will not be allowed to worship the religion that they worship. None of that will be allowed. That you want to bring these people back, and they will be basically illegal creatures on their own land. And then, since we're a democracy, they'll all be able to vote. But we all know they will then, as they block, all vote, as they did before, for a pro-Russian government, and we'll have a pro-Russian government. It is absurd to even believe that argument. That argument in itself makes no sense. That they are genuine in how they want to, we want to bring all of these people back, and they'll basically be illegal human beings. The whole thing is preposterous.
Right. I agree. Now, as you are well aware, because I think you also endorsed the appeal that Helga Zepp-LaRouche wrote recently in the wake of the European freakout about everything that's going on, and her warning that if the European leadership doesn't come to its senses, they're headed down a pathway like what happened in 1933. These various statements about 800 billion euros for rearming Europe and the French nuclear umbrella and all of this. I mean, this is really quite wild. What is your sense of the dynamic between the European leadership, the American leadership and also the European people and the American people and what's happening within NATO?
I think that the Europeans' plan for rearmament is quite honestly preposterous. It is preposterous. Number one, I mean, I could go in so many levels, but just do a few. Number one, so they don't have the money. So they're saying we're going to spend 800 and some billion dollars, which we don't really have. We saw a year or so ago where the Germans said we're going to rearm and we're going to spend 300 billion euros, whatever it was. And within a few months, they were like, I guess we're not going to do it. Because as soon as they tried, they're like, we don't have the money. And as soon as we get it, we got to pay some of it out because it's a loan. And holy moly, the numbers don't work, right? So they're saying that, but let's just say for the sake of argument, they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to cut all of our social programs, college, healthcare, all of those things. We're going to cut all of that stuff out so that we can now prepare for war with Russia. Well, they'd have a revolution on their hands because the people would go bananas. Number one. Number two, they don't have the industrial infrastructure to do it anyway. Even if they had the money, you know what I mean? You could give me right now on my 1.5 acre plot of land that I own, and I'm proud of it. It's mostly woods. But you could say, Garland, here's $100 billion and to build tanks. Well, unless you can build them with a chainsaw and, and in my little John Deere that I pull around tractor, then yeah, I probably can't build tanks.
So, and also, let me just say, related to your hat there about Nord Stream, aren't they having some energy problems? I mean, you do need energy for heavy manufacturing.
I guess they'll have to call the Russians so that they can get cheap energy, so they can have the energy infrastructure they need to build and prepare for war against the Russians. The whole thing is absurd. Might I add, here's the other thing. The neoliberal nature of the EU. Look at von der Leyen. She was caught with these Pfizer gate with her. If you recall, a while back, a number of people in the EU were caught with Qatar with some big scandal where they were getting money. You probably recall that, right? So there is a fundamentally corrupt nature to the European Union. If $800 billion gets around that, that's like what's been going on in Kiev. When that money gets there, all of the criminals come in and they just all get a slice of the pie. You give $800 billion to Brussels and those corrupt criminals will steal 801 billion. You give them 800 billion, they'll steal all of it, and they'll try to find another billion to steal that isn't there. So the bottom line is, due to endemic corruption, due to the lack of industrial infrastructure, as we said, the lack of energy, they no longer have the infrastructure to support the industry. Might I add, here's another problem you need. You need people who know how to do this stuff. How long would it take you to train people to work in that industry? The whole thing is absurd. Now, don't get me wrong, if the $800 billion, it's going to be just like Kiev. If you get the money there, people will be happy to steal it. So if they're able to get the $800 billion or however much they get, the corrupt criminals will all get their hands in the pocket, and it'll end up in Cyprus and in Caribbean island banks, etc. So the Russians don't have to worry about the infrastructure for a military industrial complex suddenly appearing. Those criminals will steal every penny of it. So I guess in a way, that's the good news if you're Russians.
Right. I think that's a little bit like the New York elections and the 8-to-1 ratio on matching funds, frankly. It sounds very similar. But I will say one advantage of getting the gas flowing through pipelines back into Europe means that the Russians would not be able to use those pipelines for surprise military maneuvers, which they just did so brilliantly in Kursk. I mean, that was truly amazing. I can't even think of going 9 miles through a 1.4 meter diameter pipeline.
Well, that brings something up that is also critical to this same discussion that we were having. Why were they able to do that? Because the people of Russia are patriotic. They see Nazis on their border, on their doorstep again, and they feel as though we're defending our homeland, and they're willing to put their lives on the line. So a bunch of Europeans who have like Macron and Starmer, they're going to build something for the future. They're lucky to have 6 months in power. The people are trying to throw them out of power right now. And they're saying they're going to get on their horse and take out their sword and lead the charge and lead the people into battle against Russia. The people ain't looking to fight Russia. They're looking to fight them. So how is a country or, an economic bloc that has not been able to deliver for the people? The people are furious. The people are looking for they used to say, Malcolm X once said about the field slaves, if somebody said to them, do you want to run away? They'd always say, any place is better than here, right? You got people in Europe. I don't know if you know about it. They're having a problem with brain drain in the UK. People who can afford to leave the UK are getting the hell out. They're like, this place is a disaster. How are you going to say to a population of people who are miserable, who are furious, who are saying we need jobs, we need modern electricity and infrastructure, we need the things that just to make our material things we need to have a decent life and to raise a family. How are you going to say to those people, we, the people who have screwed you over and destroyed your life, your present, and your future, are now going to lead you into war against the Russians to get you slaughtered? That's not going to work. The whole thing is just a sick, twisted delusion of the ruling elite in Europe.
Well, I want to get your thoughts on something related to that, because I'll tell you, and I just ran actually twice for U.S. Senate. My friend Jose Vega is running for Congress now. And we do a lot of organizing, talking to the man in the street, talking to people. I'm working on something now with some farmers in the state of New York. And I definitely have a sense in the United States that while people were enormously relieved to be rid of the Harris, Biden, Genocide Joe crew and get Trump elected, and there's a great deal of enthusiasm and tens of thousands of people show up, but I think there's a terrible vulnerability there because the American people are suffering, as you say, the Europeans are. The hyperinflation is catastrophic. The cost of housing, the condition of the roads, we have airplanes catching on fire every 5 seconds on the runway. I mean, everything seems to be disintegrating. And I think if there's not something done in the very near term to actually address the physical conditions of life for the American people, this administration is going to find itself in a lot of trouble. And I'm actually concerned about that because I want to see them succeed at ending this conflict and changing the dynamic in the world. But I think it is not a strong or stable situation. What do you think about that?
I think you're 100% on the money. Well, if I may do a little bit of history about this administration and the understanding of it, the concept of it that people have, right? Particularly Democrats, but a lot of people have this concept that MAGA, that the Trump MAGA group is all about Trump, that it's about Trump. There's a people who Trump came along, they love Trump, they support Trump no matter what. That's not true at all. So here's what happened. And I saw this firsthand. I was at Fox when the Tea Party was running. What happened? You had 2008. There was a left wing and a right wing populist, if that's the word, reaction. The so-called left wing was the Occupy Wall Street movement. In my opinion, I could be wrong. I feel that was that was basically agent provocateurs. Were able to infiltrate it. They were able to turn it into somewhat of an anarchic situation. People would come in and say, what do you want? They'd say, get away. We don't want anything. They had a little.
May I tell you, because I was there for the beginning of that, the first rally. And you may or may not be aware that actually Teresa Heinz Kerry was a big funder of it. We learned later. And because of course LaRouche has been saying we got to bury Wall Street so deep that the stench can't get back up, Glass-Steagall, bankruptcy, reorganization, and people were thrilled that someone was finally standing up to Wall Street. People were dropping off pizzas, and And then exactly, you go to get certain demands. We had a caucus on reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act, which would go a very long way to separating the wheat from the chaff with these banks. And what happened was they said exactly what you said. No demands. We're not allowed to make any demands. And then you had all these former convicts and drug addicts moving in and camping in the tents and raping people. I mean, it just became a sordid mess. So I just wanted to interject that because I think absolutely it was the case. So please continue.
Yes, and I heard all of those stories. And so I saw that it was infiltrated by agent provocateurs. It was highly infiltrated, and it was taken in a direction where, number one, asked for nothing. Number two, then when they were able to get it in full anarchy, what they had to do, anything they wanted to do had to be a unanimous vote, which meant you only need, if you got 3 or 4 agent provocateurs, every time you have a vote, one of them votes no. And it was over for it. So it went nowhere. It got nothing. Boom. They were able to, let's just say it died birthing. Okay. Then on the right, there was the Tea Party. The Tea Party, what were they angry at? They were angry over the 2008 crash. They were angry over the same thing. They were angry over, particularly what infuriated them was the bailouts. Why is all this money going to the rich and we're suffering? Okay, it was very, very valid. They voted a bunch of Tea Party people in 2010. And of course, they just got in Congress and filled their filthy, stinking pockets and did what people do when they get to Congress. So they were furious. They were wandering around aimlessly in the wilderness. And along comes Donald Trump, who is a good entertainer. And he sees that. He takes it by the helm. He gives them the rhetoric that they want. And boom, MAGA is born. MAGA is nothing but the Tea Party. And Donald Trump did not form MAGA. Donald Trump took the Tea Party and he renamed it. He gave it a new name. He gave it a hot new name, Make America Great Again. He took ownership of that name. He went with red hats, with MAGA, sounds good, all that kind of stuff. Donald Trump was able to take the Tea Party and turn it into something that worked on television, that worked with rhetoric, that worked with slogans, all the things you need, and it blew up. MAGA blew up. It's cool to be MAGA if you're on the right. They gave people a group to belong to. So for Trump, he took that, he's able to do that. But keep in mind something, they were there before Trump and they had an agenda before Trump, and Trump's not down with that agenda, in my opinion, to a large extent. He's still a member of the ruling elite. So now what Trump's starting to run into a bit is they're the Tea Party. And he did, and I think Trump felt, when I come in this time, I can do whatever I want. And he brings in the richest man in the world, and off they go to do their stuff. I mean, if you you have to be suspicious about Peter Thiel, the whole PayPal mafia. You have to be very, very suspicious and keep your keep your eyes and ears open about Musk and Thiel and the South Africa PayPal mafia people. It's not absurd to have some concerns about that and some suspicions about that, right? Because regardless of what Trump wants, regardless of what his MAGA base wants, these people are very, very powerful and very, very treacherous. And there will be some contradictions there. Anyway, so now those of us who have concerns, first of all, we want peace. Number one, we almost all got nuked. We might be out of the woods, but we ain't out of the woods yet. So we have to be, first of all, concerned with, first things first, we got to get the peace. And then we can work on the other things. And so I think the concern now is, in my opinion, the Trump administration, for whatever reason, we can talk about that. Do they want to go after China? That's a possibility, whatever the case may be, but maybe even a likelihood. But they want out of the Ukraine conflict. But something is becoming obvious, but they don't know how to do it. They want out, but they really don't know how to do it. And they're really floundering. And the truth is, maybe Trump should have listened to Steve Bannon when Steve Bannon said, just walk away right off immediately. I don't know. But I think, so in a nutshell, I think that's where we are now. The Trump administration wants out, but they don't know how to get out. And they're stumbling now. And now we've gone from they're on a move to, I think they've made a really, really bad move here. It went from, we're going to ask for a ceasefire. Okay. and there's a ceasefire that the Russians won't take. And everybody's like, oh, it's a trap. The Russians did a great job. They took the ceasefire and they said, you know what? It's a great idea, ceasefire. We're all for that. But we need to talk about it a little bit here. Take that back and let's work on some things. Because what you have now is a dynamic where you have negotiations going on. You've handed them something, they've handed you back. That means you got to touch it up and hand it back to them. That's negotiations. Perfect. Excellent, beautiful job by the Russians, right? And right. Whoever was evil trying to trap them, their trap has failed. Okay. And then Donald Trump made a dramatic mistake in allowing someone to convince him and say to the Russians, what about those people you have surrounded? Because that blew a lot of stuff out of the water. If I'm the Russians, I now look at it and I suspect maybe that's what this whole thing was about. Maybe you're just going along here and you just sent me something because I just trapped all of these Ukrainians because I was successful in a military operation and now you're trying to get them out of it. Well, I don't know how much you know about the Russians. It ain't going to work. You know what I mean? Historically speaking, they kind of surround the enemy and annihilate them. That ain't working. That is not the Russian way of warfare. So, but I think this was a miscalculation by the Trump administration. And I suspect that it wasn't Donald Trump, because Donald Trump doesn't give a crap about Ukraine. He wants that. I suspect that Donald Trump wanted to talk to Vladimir Putin about this, and that some nefarious entity around Donald Trump said, well, while you're talking to him, you think you could ask him about those troops in Ukraine? And in doing that, it blew the rest of it out of the water. It was a very, very poor strategic move. And I don't think it was his move. I think somebody, again, I'm just speculating, asked him to throw that in there. And then that becomes the entire topic. And that becomes everybody looking at it saying, yeah, so that's what it was really about. Bad move. Well, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I think that Trump definitely wants peace. Mm-hmm. I think he doesn't know how. I think part of the problem is that the United States has so lost its identity. I mean, if you go back and look at what John Quincy Adams said in that 4th of July speech in 1825, I think that might be the year, his 4th of July speech, where he says for 42 years, or how many, we have not invaded another country. We love freedom, but if we get involved in a conflict in some other country, we will lose our own spirit. And then the famous quote, seek not abroad for monsters to destroy. But it was in the context, it was not isolationist. I mean, this guy had been to Russia, it was not an isolationist idea, but an idea of the United States as being an embodiment of a principle of goodness and freedom. Also, that so many of the founding fathers understood very much that the question of slavery was a direct affront to the reasons for why they created the Republic. That took longer to correct thanks to various Boston Brahmin, British and other instigations. But there was the principle of our republic where it wasn't peace through strength, where you threaten to bludgeon someone or starve them with sanctions, but peace through prosperity, or demonstrating that you could ensure a certain kind of standard of living for the population as a whole, those kind of things. And somehow, I think in our society today, we have this very peculiar idea about, while we preach freedom, we think the only way we can get someone to do what we want is to force them, which goes completely against freedom. And this kind of paradox is very problematic if you take it to foreign policy.
Couple of things. The problem then is the problem now. There was a fundamental contradiction, because at the time he was saying, look, let's not go screw around with other people. Let's not go cause all these problems. Let's be prosperous. I've got a book around here somewhere called The Empire of Cotton. And what you realize is this. Why were they prosperous? Because they had free labor. Why did they have free labor? Because they went around the world stealing other goods. And what that they stole? They stole labor, right? That's how people like me got here, right? Stolen labor, right? You can go to somebody's country, you can steal their bananas, you can steal their steel, you can steal their labor, right? As in when we went into, what was it, 1916 or whatever it was, 1913, when they went to Haiti and just opened the vaults and took the gold right out of their vaults and brought it back. That's a theft. But labor is, capital is a commodity to some extent, as described in neoliberalism. So at the time he said, yeah, we don't want to go around the world causing problems. Well, he didn't have to, because they'd already brought the labor there. Once that labor ran out, it becomes, what are we going to do now? Because it was predatory at that time. So now the problem we have is an economy that has been predatory. You know what I mean? That too often wasn't based on, let's do the things that we can do to build our economy up here at home. Things that you and I talk about. Let's build our industry. Let's build our economy. Let's do things here at home. Instead, it was, nobody asked, why is it that if I go to the store and I buy apples, they're $2.49 a pound, and they were grown 2 hours away in Westminster, Maryland. But if I buy bananas that were 3,000 miles away, they're 39 cents a pound. Because we are predatory on the country that's selling the bananas, right? Those are the kind of discussions we have to have. And that is, our economy has a fundamental contradiction that pushes back against peace. But here's the issue. The things that you and I talk about are a domestic economy. Our economy doesn't have to be predatory, but it is, right? And so it's getting away. Those two things are fundamentally aligned, and that is having a predatory nature to your ruling elite, and at the same time going around the world overthrowing governments and starting wars. Because as Thomas Friedman said, you can't have McDonald's without McDonnell Douglas. Well, that's a lie. You can. That's what we're saying. People like you and I are saying that's a lie. The fact that you're saying we cannot have a strong economy without overthrowing governments and stealing their stuff isn't true. And I think that's what we've got to convince people of, and that's what we've got to get people behind.
Right. Well, if I may be so bold as to disagree with you on this point,
sure.
I think the slavery and the cotton and tobacco actually made us very poor and very weak. And Frederick Douglass describes this actually when he escapes and he goes to the North. And he says, I had believed that the reason why the slave owners were comfortable and prosperous in the South was because they were relying on slave labor and they had all of us waiting on them hand and foot. Then I get to the North where they don't have slaves, but they have machines. And these things are able to, and indoor plumbing, and people don't have to carry the water back and forth and this and that. And he said, I realized the whole thing was a lie, that actually relying on human labor was a way of ensuring a certain kind of backwardness, which I would say is also why the British were so interested in supporting the slave owners and the Confederacy to overthrow the direction which Alexander Hamilton, who, as you know, was a vehement opponent of slavery, as was Franklin and Quincy Adams and everyone, of those people, that circle, Gouverneur Morris, Hamilton, etc., which is that somehow you have to create a system of credit which creates the conditions where a discovery by an individual allows you to transform the standard of living of the population as a whole, and certain internal improvements in canal building or railroads or electricity actually changes the relationship between your population and nature. And I think this is why the British in particular, because these, I forget now the word, predatory systems, they actually cause the whole human economy to collapse at a certain point. They are a self-collapsing, self-defeating system, unless, of course, you can keep expanding what you're looting.
Now, here's what I'll say. You didn't disagree with me. We do agree. And I'll tell you why. Because what I meant was this. A lot of people look at the South and they say, why is the South so poor? the legacy of slavery. Because what did slavery do? It only enriched a tiny, tiny group of people. If you lived in the South, 99% of the people were poor dirt farmers, but a tiny little less than 1% were the Southern planters who owned the big farms with the slaves and all that kind of stuff. So what slavery did was it enriched a tiny, tiny group of people. But if you're a farmer in the South, because of these big slave plantations, the price of crops were driven down, which meant you couldn't make a good living. So you were going to be impoverished. So it impoverished the masses and made money for a tiny group of people. Meanwhile, here's what's interesting. When Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, the slave class got furious. They said, we don't like that. We're very angry at the Northerners. How dare they say this? Why? And of course, they said, we take care of our poor little childlike slaves. God has told us we have to take care of them because they can't take care of themselves. Yeah, it was a self-serving lie. But what did they do? They then paid for a number of books to be written to push back against Uncle Tom's Cabin. And one of them was called The Northern Planter's Bride. And The Northern Planter's Bride was interesting because it was an attack on the industrial revolution, on the industrial North. And it was correct. And what did they say? Well, you think we treat our slaves bad? Your employees are white. They're white people. And look what you do to them. And they went, the company store, they're dangerous. Their hands are getting cut off by looms. Their hair is getting yanked into this, heads pulled off, murdered, burned off. And they launched a valid argument. Now, it notwithstanding that they still had brutal slavery and they were only enriching a tiny amount of people. But the truth was, it was, okay, there are different degrees of mistreatment of labor, right? The furthest degree being slavery. Okay, they have no rights and they're considered animals. The next degree up from that is you're working in a factory and your life's a living hell and you have child labor and you work, 90 hours a week. Okay. You're not as bad as slaves, but you're not all that far up from them. Right. And I think one of the things that you and I talk about is neither one of those are a valid option for the masses. We need a system where the masses of people can have a decent, life and provide for their families, et cetera. So we're not disagreeing per se. We're still recognizing that you need a system that provides for the material needs of the masses of people, and that what was going on there, be it the industrial North and the infamous company store, or the slavery plantations of the South, wasn't the answer. And that we have people, where did that model come from? Where did it come from? Where did it come from? Where did that whole thing come from? They started with, before there was any cotton, it was sugar and it was spices and things in the Caribbean, right? And who was doing that? The Brits, first and foremost, right. The UK, right? And then, of course, Spain and all that. But the British Crown led all of that stuff and set the model for it and continued to fund it because they wanted it to keep going. And so I think we are on the same path here, and that is ultimately, when it gets down to it, how do you get around all of these things to a point where instead of you're enriching a few people, and then every now and then when the people get too jumpy, then you got to start a big war to get rid of a bunch of them.
Right, exactly. And that's the key, because it's an assumption, and we've been given this by the green ideology of overpopulation, is that you have to stifle growth. And actually, a human economy only works if there is growth. But it has to be growth informed by a more efficient use of resources, which you get if you move from burning wood to petroleum to nuclear, and hopefully fusion we will have soon, where you're using really tiny amounts of fuel for incredibly dense energy, which allows people to live more comfortably. And we've become so deeply pessimistic. I think one of the terrible things that's been done to children is this fear of climate change, and now they call weather climate, right? So if you get a really bad thunderstorm, this suddenly means that your mother was driving her car too much or something or other. The world is going to end because your parents won't stop doing whatever it is. And so people don't have a sense of the excitement of making a discovery. There's this kind of arrogance as if we know everything there is to know about the universe and every physical process, and we're not going to learn anything new that changes our relationship to it. And then that fuels into the economy where you think we have a limited pie, and if I get this, then you don't get that. If you get that, I don't get this. There's no sense of mutual benefit. And I do think that's the shift that's occurred among the global South, well, particularly the Chinese, because of Confucianism, perhaps they have a whole different idea. So I think we have to get a change in outlook here in the West. You think we can?
So let's talk about the whole issue of ecology and things like that. So initially what happened, it was bottom driven. It was, and the term that was used was pollution. And why was the term pollution used? And why was it bottom driven? Because you had Love Canal and you had rivers catching on fire and you had everyday people who could see, hear, and smell what was going on, and it was affecting their lives. And they said, hey, there's pollution. We don't like this. It's not working. And it was valid. And when someone said, I don't want methyl ethyl horrible in my river or my creek or this dumped here, it was real to them, and they saw it and they felt it, and it made them sick. So what we had was a bottom up, and the bottom up movement wasn't environmentalism. It was about pollution. Stop pouring methyl ethyl horrible in my, a very valid bottomed up movement. But once it got usurped by these ruling elites, it turned into environmentalism, and it became so nebulous that nobody knew what the hell they were talking about. And they could say to you, we've got to conserve water. And people are like, yes, got to conserve water. And I'm like, our body's 70% water. The earth's 97% water. What do you mean conserve water? I mean, you could tell me I could have a rain barrel. Okay, whatever. I don't know. I could have a rain barrel and I got all the water I want. But the idea that I have to conserve water, what sense does that make, right? And people are like, I'm working to conserve water. And they don't even know why or what that means or what conserving water does. They're just told conserve something. They like to bring all these things that mean nothing to us. So we'll think it's busy work, right? I'm busy. What are you doing? I'm fighting to conserve water. And how's that going to help anything? I don't really know, but it sure sounds good, right? And so that's what happens. Meanwhile, they say to you, look, you've got to say, and this is what happens if you are an environmentalist, as it is, or whatever term you want to use, and you're really concerned about the environment and that's your life work, and you don't want methyl ethyl horrible poured into your creek. The worst thing that has ever happened to environmentalists is the ruling elite getting their hands on this crap and coming out with these words like Green New Deal and stuff like that. Why? Because they come up with things like this. Well, let's see. Elon Musk or whoever that owns this company that makes some green so-called stuff, right? We're going to give them tax credits and carbon credits, and they can trade them and make and so basically they give like Elon Musk like carbon credits, and he like sells them for billions of dollars. That has no material effect on the economy. I mean, on the environment, none whatsoever. It's like asset-backed securities and derivatives. It's black magic. It's something that you made up. Carbon, yes, we're giving him carbon credits. That's going to help the economy. How does the economy know that you've given him carbon credits? He just made $1.5 billion because you came up with something new, because derivatives and asset-backed securities were kind of running out. So you had to make something up, and hey, carbon credit sounds good because it sounds green. It's a great, so what we ran into is just more neoliberal ways to come up with terms for them to fill their filthy, stinking pockets. And what's even worse is this. And the true people who are concerned with pollution now, nobody believes them. They're discrediting the people who are really concerned with methyl ethyl horrible being poured in their creek. And when somebody actually comes up and says, hey, I need a government agency that will come out here. I used to do this. I used to work with, believe it or not, I was an investigator for the state of Maryland for the Attorney General's office. And you know what I investigated back then in the 1980s? when somebody came out and they poured a bunch of barrels of bad stuff out there, I would do an investigation to figure out who poured those actual physical barrels of some kind of a horrible chemical into a bad place and go back into, you know, somebody's community or the woods and go back and charge this person with a crime. That's real environmentalism. They actually poured something bad in a place where it shouldn't be. Okay. That was real environmentalism. Now it's nebulous stuff. And now when the environmental agency says, we need investigators like Garland to go do that, you know what they say? That's just a bunch of green crap. We're not wasting our money on that. Cut it all out. So now we don't have the people to actually investigate the real stuff that needs to be investigated because they have so discredited everything environmentalism with this carbon credits that, and that's the worst thing. It's like racism. They come up with something like DEI. And I'm like, what does that mean? You know what it means? It means that when you go see a chewing gum commercial, there'll be one black person, one gay person, one white person, one Asian person, one this, one Muslim, that every stinking chewing gum commercial is going to look like a Benetton ad. That's what DEI means. But what happens? People look at equal employment, EEOC laws, and they say, that's just DEI, and let's get rid of all of it. So once the liberals get their hands on something, they so discredit it that the things that are actually needed, the infrastructures that were there beforehand that did good things, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. So the liberals, that not only have they totally failed, they have succeeded in destroying the infrastructure that was needed to address real problems. They're just the worst.
Yes. Now you're bringing this up, and there's a couple other things I want to get to, but I just have to say that I've been thinking a lot about this because we have the Zionism, the Christian Zionism, the Christian fundamentalism, and this very peculiar religion. And see what they're doing with finance and so-called environmentalism is like a religion. And I think part of the reason people have become so irrational is because it used to be the case. I mean, I watched my parents go from being students, one car, renting an apartment. My mother was a biochemist, my father a doctor, that you could work really hard. And if you were in a company, you get a higher and higher level position, that your actual standard of living had a relationship to how hard you worked, how much you applied yourself. Now, the people who work the very hardest are paid nothing. They're like home health aides or people who work in group homes or people who drive. I mean, people are paid really a pittance for doing the most backbreaking and also it requires thought to take care of other people, right? This is a tough job. They get paid nothing. And then people like what you're saying, the carbon swaps, oh, poof, out of thin air, we're making $1 billion. And then somehow this transfers to a religious belief that God is also irrational. And if I just pray these magic words and I know that I'm going to be saved, there's no sense of justice, of truth. I think this has kind of been a terrible situation. It's put people in a terrible frame of mind.
Yeah, and that it has resulted now, I'm glad to say, one of the results of that is that people are no longer trusting some of the institutions, such as the media, that were specifically used to create this dynamic. The media was used so much to propagandize the people, to lie to the people, to give them the enemies, to say, well, if the enemies, just to discredit, your organization. The only thing I knew about them, they're a bunch of crazy people. That's what I was told. And I was like, well, what do they think? You don't even need to know that. They're just nuts. You're branded as a bunch of crazy people. I don't need to know anything about you. And they decide tomorrow, the system could decide that I was nuts. RFK Jr., he's a madman. He's crazy. He's insane. And I was like, well, they used to say he was kind of like an environmental hero that was suing corporations. Forget all of that. He's a madman now. He's questioned vaccines. And I was like, well, doesn't he have a right to question them? I mean, isn't it kind of healthy to question things, whether you agree with them or not? So what do? They create a system where he's a situation where propaganda through the media says this person's discredited, this organization is discredited, the ruling elite doesn't like them. Well, the good thing about it is people are materially, it's not working for people. You know what I mean? The truth is this: they're listening, they're agreeing, but they're seeing the results in their everyday life aren't working for them. And so now they're going to alternative media, people such as your show, people such as this, other organizations, and they're starting to listen, saying, well, what are you guys saying? Because I've been listening to these legacy media organizations and institutions, and they've been telling me that they were right. But the end result is my life is getting worse. So I want to listen to other people. So I think the good thing that's happening is people are opening their ears to alternative groups, alternative options, alternative news sources and information sources.
Yes. So I think somehow we have to take this really complicated situation. I think that people who do want peace, and people like President Trump, who's operating, one, he's battling some of his own wrong assumptions about things. And then you have this neocon offensive, the British doing everything they can with the Europeans to undermine it. But you also have a certain calm, steadfast position from President Putin, from Xi Jinping. And I am optimistic that this Ukraine-Russia situation is going to somehow be resolved. I think the only way it becomes durable, and that we also could have any hope of getting a reasonable, non-murderous situation in Southwest Asia, which we didn't talk about today, is that we have to recognize that we're operating in a different dynamic. I mean, you cannot simply say that the 6 billion plus, or I don't know how many billions of people now are in nations represented by the BRICS and Belt and Road, because it's growing every day. You're going to have to take that into account, and you're not going to stop it, even by threatening a nuclear war. So maybe it would be better to create, and I know the Russians have talked about this now, and I think in Global Times today, what Helga Zaplarusha has been saying, we need an entirely different security paradigm. We need a new security architecture, a new economic architecture. Let's not talk about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Let's not get rid of the UN. That's the only place people can talk. But maybe we should consider that nations from Africa should be represented on the Security Council. Maybe we should reconsider the veto process and things like that. I think we have to really be willing to consider that we, sitting here in the United States with our 4% of the entire planet's population, are no longer the global hegemon. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think being in the United States puts us in a particularly tough situation, because the U.S., we're the one with the 800 or 900 bases, right? So we're kind of sitting at the front of the table of causing mischief throughout the world. So I think one of the things we have to do, what they try to train us to do in the United States is to get into camps. We're with the Democrats, we're with the Republicans, we're with Trump, we're with Biden, we're with this person. No, that person's our savior. No, I think in the current situation we find ourselves in, what we have to be able to do, because of course, Donald Trump's doing some things I absolutely disagree with. He's doing some things and he's stumbling and bumbling. Mm-hmm. I think what you have to do is this, in my opinion, currently, to kind of get through the disaster we're in alive, when President Trump does something that you approve of, that you feel is working towards peace, you have to support it for all you're worth. You have to push it and say, we got to do this. And then if he's going in a direction that you don't like, you have to make your feelings known. But it can't be, I'm anti-Trump or I'm pro-Trump. You have to see this thing systemically. And as I've said many, many times, WIIFM, what's in it for me? And I don't mean me as an individual. I mean, what's in it for us as humanity. So as I see President Trump talking with President Putin, trying to get a resolution. And of course, the Democrats, boo, Putin's evil. We don't want to do that because Trump's a bad guy and Putin's a bad guy. We got to push back against that. And then if he does something else we don't like, we got to say, hey, we're opposed to that. We don't want to deport some person because of their speech. We got to be able to push back. But I think now you have to be agile when it comes to politics. You have to be fluid when it comes to politics, and you can't fall into a particular camp because there are very serious issues at hand.
Exactly. And I do think as Americans, we should want the Trump presidency to be successful because it's good for our nation and it's good for the American people. And if he does things that are bad for the American people and bad for the world, he will not be successful. It will be a failure. And I think it then just really underscores tell the truth, stand for principle, and don't seek to sabotage an administration. We have to create the conditions where it can work. And I think we can learn a lot by looking at the diplomatic skills of some other leaders around the planet.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that there are people that are going to go after Donald Trump for some of his weaknesses. Yes, I'm not saying Donald Trump's perfect or he's great or he's a good president or he's a bad president. I think that's irrelevant. I think we have to focus on the issues. One of the unfortunate things that has happened in recent years is we've been pushed into the politics of personality, where we have to identify with the person who's in office as opposed to our particular values. And I think I agree with what you said. Our politics have to be about our values. We have to chart our course of what we believe should happen and how we believe it should happen. And we should, maintain course and speed, as they say, on what, and whoever happens to be in president. Donald Trump could disappear into an alternative dimension tomorrow and we never see him again. That won't change the things that we need to do and the course that we believe needs to be charted. We're still going to say we need peace. We need people need jobs. What does it change? I've once heard, what's the 5 things people need? They need healthcare, jobs, education. I forgot it was 5 things, but working families are still going to need all 5 of those things. Even though I can't remember what they are, they're still going to need them.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you very much. And I understand from Dennis that you will be joining the Schiller Institute conference on Memorial Day weekend, May 24th and 25th at some point.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
That. Yeah, I want to encourage everyone here to visit the schillerinstitute.com website to register for that, to join us there. We do have to work together to get the kind of policies that are needed. And I want to thank you very much for joining me this evening.
Thank you.